tough. And all I mean by that they're tough is they're a very difficult read.
Mm, yeah, yeah,
So you're really not sure what's going on. And so you have to, it's one of those clients that, and it's wonderful because it's one of those clients where you have to literally, it's very good for the ego. It takes yourself out of it
good,
to say,
good. You have to
you
trust
know,
you're not knowing. You have to trust that you don't know.
just have to trust that, we're doing the work together. If she chooses to come back, she comes back. If she chooses not to, not sure if she's benefiting from it, doesn't matter. You just have to just be. And
Yeah,
that's what's wonderful sometimes about having clients like that, because you really have there is nothing.
excellent. Yes, yes.
However, she did make the commitment of coming, that first time. And when I suggested coming back the two more times before I leave, she did.
Oh, wow. Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. One thing I do want to share, talking about the jaw. I think I've maybe mentioned this before, but when it comes to tension, there's particular tensions, and tension tends to balance itself out over the system, right? So if we think of a spider web, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
as being the tension lines in the body, yeah, but now you get a fly that comes into that spider web and it gets knotted up in the web, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So now what's happened to the entire web? Yeah, once the fly has wrapped itself up, the web is still stable, yeah, but you've got a knot around where the fly is, yes. And so it's taken the threads that were evenly the tension distributed and it's pulled it into one little knot, but the rest of it, the tension is spread out evenly over the rest of the web, yes.
Okay.
All right, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
All right,
Yes.
so we get this happening in the body as well. I never knew that this had a name, but I sort of discovered this, I don't know, fairly recently, but I've known of this all my life pretty much. And it's they call it guarding, where you have something that is painful in the body, and that becomes the fly, and that tension around the fly is there to isolate that pain, right? That whatever's being caused by the fly now is the pain, as it were, yeah. But because it's wrapped up all around that's isolated, and you've got the tension is now the overall tension in the body is higher. Obviously, around the guarding, it's a lot higher around the fly, but there isn't that specific pain there, right? And I know this because I've had tonsillitis all my life, right? I mean, I nearly died from it as a kid, and they didn't take my tonsils out uh, because they were too swollen. And it's just interesting, my parents got divorced when I was 10, and he never wanted to have them taken out for me because he didn't want to put me on antibiotics. He was very very strict and cautious with using antibiotics. He predicted the problem that America has now with the super viruses and the super bacteria, whatever not super viruses, the super, I think they call them super. Anyway, they antibiotics. They resistant to antibiotics, and so they
Mhm.
have a problem with this because that's the problem with the things. The more you use it, the more you create the effect for it being countered and worked against. So anyway, so I've had this all my life, but as a result, I mean, when I say he moved away when I was 12 out of the town where we were. So then the whole thing just fell by the wayside, and it never got to a point where they got removed. So I always just had this, and as a result, the tensioning that guarding around the tonsils has caused jaw tension, neck tension, shoulder tension. It all kind of trickles down. And I've been working on untensioning things most of my life also. And it's really difficult because when you pull on one, you pull on another. And when you relax one, another tension. So it's all, it's just
Yes.
a complex system, as you know. So I'm figuring this out still as I go along, but it's really something very powerful to understand, though, that you may find that you have tension, but if you release that tension, you may activate a pain.
Yes.
So this is important to understand, and you've got to be willing to go through that, to say, I'm going to accept this pain so that I can heal it, and therefore I can now not have to guard it. Plus, also, as adults, we're able to deal with the pain a lot easier than we can as children. So, and also, like in the case of the tonsils, they may not be super inflamed right now, but I have memories of where, you have really bad tonsillitis and, you can't swallow, you can't talk, you can't do anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I nearly died from it a couple times too, but it has that trickle down effect, and it's messed up other things too in the body, so, the glands were always swollen and, messed up, teeth were bad and stuff like this. So, yeah, I just,
But now, that's very interesting because now had you gotten the tons, this is one of those things, where people say, oh, I don't want to do anything.
yeah,
But sometimes if you do something, it could help. So you don't have down the line.
correct.
But you don't know what's right or what's wrong or what's supposed to be or what's
Right.
not. I mean, that's just that's where that whole trust comes in.
Yeah, I would imagine that, he would have waited. As I grew older, the tonsillitis was less severe, and I suspect that he knew this, and he would have waited until I had a period where I wasn't, where it was very mild. I mean, I always have it; they always swollen, regardless, but not swollen. There's degrees of swollenness, right? Where they just mildly bothered, and then put me on antibiotics to reduce it, and then have them taken out. But not, they wouldn't have required such a severe course of antibiotics. I'm assuming that was what
Right.
you was hoping for, the logic. But since he moved away, that never happened. Never got taken care of. So, and just, I just learned. After a while, the body adjusted to it, and I never got to have that severe tonsillitis. Every now and then, yes, but not, with a high fever and all that. So I
Right.
guess the body just adjusted. But
And listen, I know exactly what you're saying because when I was a child, I experienced the same things.
yeah.
Not necessarily about the antibiotic thing, but I also had tonsillitis as a child,
Oh,
very
interesting.
bad. And I would continually get it. And then as I have grown now, I guess off and on through the years, I would have sore throats, but now, knock on wood,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
too have learned to work with, discover,
Yeah.
meet with, experience, and it's become less.
Yeah. I just think after a while, the tonsils, from being inflamed and bothered, I think they start to deteriorate, as it were, and kind of shrivel and become nothing. I don't even know if I have any tonsils left. I haven't had a doctor look at it for, I don't know, decades. So I don't know. Yeah. But the tension has remained. But I work on it every day, every night when I go to sleep, every morning when I wake up. I work at this repurposing of tension, and it's very powerful. And you hear my voice today because this morning, particularly, I succeeded in releasing the neck, and you can hear it in my voice. Yes.
Wow, very nice.
So I'm trying to hold on to it, because this is part of habits and patterns. Is that if you can make a breakthrough, but then, as you get immersed in the day, you fall back into that. And
Yes.
particularly with body patterns, this happens so quickly, you don't even know it. Sometimes from the moment that I'm focusing on it to when I get up, boom, it's gone. So really focusing on voice is very profound. Change your voice, change yourself. Incredible way to change yourself. It's like you walk a different walk, be a different person. Very profound, very profound. So it's all interconnected, though. This is the key. It's all interconnected. And here's the other point that I want to make, that once that once that fly in the spider web has settled down and it's not struggling anymore, right? The web stabilizes and it becomes neutral again. Now, over time, and I leave up some spider webs. I like them because they do catch insects. So I'm not one of those people who is obsessed, or you've got to remove a spider web. When I was kids, this was like part of your dusting duties. You got to get rid of the spider webs. I never
Mhm.
understood why, because they catch the flies and the mosquitoes and things. So I leave them up. I like them. I know it doesn't look so cool, but anyway. I have some in my bathroom in particular, a nice big one, which is nice. But the spiders have gone because there's not enough food for them. But the web is still there, which is rather interesting. But anyway, I was trying to say though that once that, and I noticed too that sometimes the spiders have there, and I don't know, they never seem to eat that fly that's in there or something, but it just stays there, and the web restabilizes now. It's got a new neutral, even though that neutral has got tension in it, obviously because of the fly, right? And here's the thing though, in our bodies, when we get that new neutral, that we don't even know there is a fly in the web.
Hmm.
It's a very profound point. So I discovered this because I had, my shoulders were always tense, not because I'm tense, but because of earnestness. But it's also related to the tonsils. It all works together, right? So I started with this to release this tension and work on it. And this is a long project because it's, you know, I don't know. I learned to relax, but relaxing didn't resolve the issue. And it would just come back again. It was all about inner habits. But the deepest problem of this was becoming aware of that fly that you had no idea was there. It doesn't feel like there's tension. So you have to feel each part of the web deliberately, individually, to say, is this tension? Is it not? And kind of, stretch it out, compress it, and oh. And then you get through this, you start to become aware, oh, here's something going on here, and I had no idea what, right? And then you start to feel different things. You see the interconnectivities, and it's just a slow, long process. I don't know. I'm hoping to, at the end of it all, when it all fits together, when I sort of unravel the whole thing, I'll figure out an easier way to do it. But in the meantime, it's just a very slow process. But I wanted to make this point that we don't even know there are tensions. You, as a practitioner, might come to know this, particularly with your direct perceptions. You can go directly to the key trigger point, I'm assuming. Yeah. But for the individual to do this themselves, this is very, very difficult because it
It,
doesn't feel like it's an issue.
it was very, very, very interesting. It was nice, and looking forward to seeing how she does through the week, and it'll be very
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, 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 yeah. Have you had any more direct perceptions come up with anyone?
None. I mean, if I have none that have stood out, like there's nothing that stood out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. With new things, unusual things, our inner bureaucrats aren't very fond of them. So they tend to want to categorize them, minimize them, make them usual, make them normal. They like safety and security. They like boring because that's their mandate. The mandate is to keep you alive. So boring is the best way to stay alive, yes, because that's lowest risk, right? Right, Robin? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is, be with the direct perceptions, you have to actively pursue them and go after them and make an effort to acquire them, because your inner bureaucrats are going to try and stabilize things where you don't have them, because that throws them out. They don't know how to deal with it, right? Or when you do get them to get internally to like, oh well, it just is what it is, and this is just part of my life. to normalize them, even though you have a part of you that enjoys them and is excited about it. But to normalize it. You see what I mean? Otherwise, it will get normalized to not happen rather than normalized to happen.
The other thing is I was going to go down to Florida this Sunday,
Yeah.
and I know I had kept saying, why don't we go down the following week? Why don't we go down the following week?
Mm.
Because Kevin was away this past week and he actually goes away again tomorrow. And long story short, when I was sharing with Kevin, and I don't know how, and all of a sudden he goes, well, what if you just go down the following week? So I'm going down the following week. And do you know how much better I feel? Because this whole time I've been saying, why don't I go down the week of February 11th versus February 5th? And so now I'm going to wait a week, and I'm not going to put anything on my plate. I'm done with work on Friday. I'm going to take the following week just to get myself together here. And then we're going to wind up going down to Florida. Like he'll drive down with me for a little bit, but
Excellent.
just,
Excellent.
I don't know that, I mean, I would have done it, but there just felt like it was too much. And I can't even explain it. I felt congested. I felt like it was too soon. And as soon as Kevin shifted and said, well, what about the following week? It was, oh,
Wonderful. Wonderful.
it
Yes.
shortened my trip down in Florida, but it
Yes.
still just felt so,
Yeah, right.
it just felt
Well,
better. It just felt
yes.
better. It felt right. It felt,
Yes. Yes. This is one of the other major payoffs of impeccability. When we have developed impeccability as a habit, and along with it, of course, is profound self-honesty. When that has become habitual and become a non-negotiable part of our being, at that point, we can trust the body. People get in trouble with trusting their bodies. In other words, their intuitive feelings. This feels right because they're not honest, and particularly self-honest. Because they're not self-honest, of course, they learn to lie to themselves. And they can get feelings for what they want, but not what is appropriate for them to have. Yes?
yes,
Does it
but
make
I
sense?
did not feel, it's interesting because I can hear what you're saying. And again, it would have been okay, but you're right. That inner just felt like it was getting cramped. I felt my inner
Right,
was getting
right.
cramped.
I'm trying to say that you can trust your body now, right?
Yes.
Because you've developed this habit of being self-honest. And the impeccability that goes with it. It has a consequential effect, right? A trickle-down effect, which is very, very big deal. And it's very important to understand this. And also to understand the relationship here. Because a lot of people don't realize that, we see on online, on Facebook, on the internet all the time, people talking about the intuition and trust your intuition, trust your gut and all this. Yeah, trust your gut if you're self-honest, yes.
Right.
Otherwise, forget about it. You're going to have trouble. Right? Your gut's going to lie like crazy to you. Yeah. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yes, because all right,
Yeah.
you just asked me about did I have any other clients? So I
Mm.
did have another client this week, a new client, and they wear a CPAP machine. And so when we were sharing in the beginning, and she was sharing a
What
little
is
bit,
that exact? Sorry.
those CPAP machines, those ones that they wear at night to help them breathe.
Right. So
Okay.
it's extra oxygen. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
So
All right.
what was interesting about this particular client is that she gets on my table and she shares about, and let's just call it stress. Okay. She shares about the stress in her life. And I think, we're going to say think, that
Mm.
between her one acupuncturist and herself, that one of the reasons she's coming to me is because of the stress. And okay, I'm used to this. But she also shares about the CPAP. And as I'm sitting there listening to her, and she is explaining to me exactly how this CPAP is on her head, I'm going, okay. But then I place my hands on her, and we are
Interesting.
going through, the session. And when we get done, I'm going, it was interesting because for me, it's like, this client, you don't need to come to me for the stress. It's actually because of the CPAP, the way it constricts the cranium. That's why this treatment, I mean, overall, it's going to be a wonderful thing for her, from head to toe, but not just coming from that stress side. Usually with a client, I'd say, you know what, maybe you should come back, next week because we're dealing with trauma, whatever, stress. But for her, it was one of those times where it was, you know what, for me, like the treatment with me, I would just suggest once a month, once every 5 weeks, you come to me because of the restrictions, because you're doing really well with how she was on the table, what she was sharing. You have all the tools, you're working all the tools. Yes, I can assist you, but the benefit of the CPAP machine restricting you or constricting you, that's what our session is going to be more about.
That's what's causing it.
And
Interesting. So it's about mitigating the downsides of the CPAP machine.
yes, and she needs it. She knows she needs it. She knows the benefits of it for her. She's very aware of that. Yes, I've made amends, that this helps me. I see a difference. So we have to go with this. And I even mentioned to the acupuncturist, because I said, this is even a client that if you wanted to treat her with the acupuncture and I just come in and do a couple of releases with with holding her cranium, she's going to get the benefits.
Yeah.
But doesn't need, unless she chooses, a full-on treatment. And
Right. Well, then you've got to explain to her that she has something that gives her.
I can't hear you.
Correctly?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, sorry. So I was saying, she's going to come to you, and you're going to relieve the cost of the benefits of the CPAP machine, right? There's a
Yes,
price she pays, and the price she pays is in physical tensions and stresses. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So that CPAP machine is like, it causes flies in the web. Yeah.
Yes. And so just needs a little assistance in relief. But for me, and I've had this happen one or two times, is that this is a client that, I guess what I'm used to of, why clients come to me, it's really, it wasn't the same.
Yeah.
So let's just, just to compare, so that one with the jaw that I mentioned, like that we started with, this was a client that came in with all these anxiety and physicality, and it was, oh, okay, we need a couple of sessions here. Whereas this particular client came in, yes, with, a little bit of stress and discomfort, but it's like, okay, this client, we don't need to see you every single week. I mean,
Yes. It's not a major issue that she's dealing with, but a side effect.
yes.
Yeah. It's not coming from a root problem that's now spreading through the things. So it's not really a major fly in the web that's causing attention, or multiple flies like it is with most people, but it's rather just, like maybe the wind on the web, because it's a constant, right? So it's an artificial overall presence. And but when you explain to them that it's dealing with side effects, not an issue, and that will help the client themselves too, right? To say, look, you've got something that's artificial on the body, and of course it causes a little bit of stress. No, it's not a major thing, but it does need to be done with. But you don't need it every week. Once a month is enough. Your client will be very happy to hear that, I'm sure. No?
Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah. No, very cool, Robert. Very cool. But I want to go back to our own feelings. Like you were saying, it with when Florida got shifted, it felt right to you. Yes.
Yes.
When we start to uh, like I was saying, when impeccability starts to become part of our habit, then we can start to trust those feelings more and more until we get to a point where those are harmonized and we've proven to ourselves that those feelings are valid, are legitimate. And then we can learn to trust them implicitly. And then we have an incredible tool at our disposal. Doesn't mean we aren't going to always check them because it's part of our impeccability. Yes, we are. But it gives us a mechanism for dealing with the world that most do not have. Most people would like to trust their gut, and they say, I do. But, if you actually look at this, from a statistical point of view, and you actually follow up on it, you'll see that it's like 50-50. Yeah, it's not very reliable for most people because they don't have impeccability and they're not self-honest, right? So it doesn't always work for them, but we can train it. We can train ourselves to be so, because of course the other part of the whole thing, and with the gut especially, is you need to have not only the willingness but the ability to face and deal with the awful truth. If you can't do that, your gut is going to tell you when something is an awful truth. Yes.
Yes.
And if you aren't able to handle it, if you're not willing to face and deal with it, well, then you're going to say, nah, it can't be right, or you're going to suppress it or whatever. You don't want to deal with it. See, and that's the problem with most people. We have the skill, but if they don't develop that ability, you cannot use the skill. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So also, the body has its own agenda, so we have to keep that in mind too. Yeah. Has its survival agendas. So, but still, the body's a very, very powerful tool, and it has, the body is more than just the physicality, of course. Like when we sense and perceive things, like your perceptions, we have senses that, from a scientific point of view, don't really exist, right? But they do, obviously, because, like, as you know, you've had perceptions and understandings and awarenesses that you had no business knowing, right?
Right.
Right. So you just have to make peace with that and say, well, there's no explanation for it at current. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how it comes about. What matters is its value to you. Yeah. And it's very valuable to you. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the key with this is some people have these, but again, because of the few key elements that aren't present, impeccability, self-honesty. Of course, self-honesty is impeccability is the big category. Self-honesty is crucial for impeccability, and also the willingness to face and deal with the awful truth. Those are all key factors that enable your perceptions to be valuable and accurate, right? Without them, forget it. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very crucial point to understand this. Yeah, I'm belaboring it somewhat and going over it multiple times, but it's very key to see how it integrates, because, of course, you're going to have this with your clients also, right? If they aren't impeccable or willing to face the awful truth or self-honest, then they might have distortions. And that's usually when you see the stuff, when there is something that's trying to become aware, but somebody is refusing to acknowledge that awareness. Now you get a distortion in the web. Yes.
Yes.
So, I'm assuming well, I think that client with the arm, right?
Mm-hmm.
as you were saying, there were further ongoing issues with her. Yes,
Yes,
and 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 I'm assuming this is because of not wanting to face and deal with the awful truth. Yeah.
absolutely.
So it may
Absolutely.
be that you might have to, like you've got your introduction when your clients first come to them, and you say, look, I do things a little differently, and you basically give your sort of disclaimer, and I would add to that disclaimer, look, if you want to get full value out of me, just know now already that some of the things that I may release are going to be very uncomfortable or painful even. They're going to be awful truths. And if you really want to resolve your longer term issue, then this is something that you're just going to have to deal with. There's no way around it. Otherwise, nobody can help you, because that awful truth is what's causing the symptoms or the avoidance of that, right? So that's
Mhm.
just how it is. There's no way around this. If you want actual relief longer term, you're going to have to do this. And yes, I can help you get there to the focal point of it, but you're going to have to, deal with the consequence of it. Yeah. I don't know. You have to, find a way to work that into your sharing with them.
Um, just wanna
It's
see.
amazing to me. It's amazing, amazing, amazing to me. When I look at this from a big overall point of view, how avoidance of the awful truth, which is, of course, coupled to self honesty, how these are, it's like the root of almost every problem, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. It's astonishing how much trouble it causes, which is, at root is basic lack of impeccability. It's why, when I made that, uh, you know, I made a program to introduce how to do way of impeccability. And I have those nine tasks of doing, right? Which of course include doing the repeat backs and the takeaways, dictionary of power, coming on Zoom, posting, all that stuff. But the first one is self-honesty and honesty. That's the first task of doing. I mean, when I started, I sort of took that somewhat for granted, that people are coming here, that they have that. Like you came with the intent to learn and grow, and that self-honesty and honesty was there as a just something that was there, right? As an intent, it was part of your intent to learn and grow and change. But I thought, that uh, I wanted to emphasize it more, because once it starts to be emphasized, and we resolve, we set our intent to be self-honest, and this is important, because much like that fly gets in the web, gets normalized, and the tension gets rebalanced and redistributed, so too can it happen with internal awful truths or lies, right? We don't even know they're there after a while, right? Because they get stuck long in the past. Our awareness and our consciousness have moved on, so we don't even know they're there anymore. So it's very good to be really, really focused and conscious of this, to know. Yeah.
The other thing I liked about last week that we had touched upon, and I brought it into my sessions, was that what you had mentioned about that spark.
About what?
The spark with the key, with the car and the spark.
Oh, right, right.
And
Finding
it was
the
wonderful because
yes,
I had a couple
yes.
of clients where I was able to use that analogy, because you can hear them, and it was wonderful because it reminded me of me, where,
Mm,
okay, I know that the key does this, I know all the tools, I know this, I know that, but until
right,
I had that spark where it was that
exactly,
connection. And
exactly.
so when I was with a couple of clients last week after we had gone over this, I was going, oh my gosh, I'm listening to this client and it's yup, yup, yup. But I can also hear, but they don't have the spark. They don't have the connection because
Exactly.
they know all
Exactly.
this stuff. And I go, and I remember
Yeah.
being here.
Yeah. 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 It's very useful. Analogies are very powerful, and I like them a lot, because when somebody's not working, if you think of it like a car, You say, well, okay, the car's not starting. Well, what's the problem here? Well, all right, the key's turning, but it's not working. There's some problem between the wires from the key to the battery, which the battery now sends that power, which makes the spark happen, right? And the
Yep.
spark, and well, first thing that you have that makes the spark is your starter motor, right, which turns the thing. And anyway, so it all works together. But this is very key, which we don't really understand how they all work together and are integrated. But you can bypass the battery and the starter motor if you get the car running without that, depending on the cars. I don't know, maybe modern cars, they couldn't do that. But in the old days, like I had a VW bus, which I drove for a very long time without a battery. I couldn't afford it. The battery died, and I would just, push start the car to get it. I was parked on hills and stuff like that. Anyway, the student days. So I'm just saying, that once we understand how it works, you can bypass certain things. And also to let people know that, hey, your system overall is working, but you've got this particular, thing here or that thing there. So, it just when they realize that it's all interconnected like that, but you can go more directly to the cause of things, it helps a lot. Yeah.
Sil, did you ever go to college?
Yeah. I went to university. Yeah.
Over in South Africa or over here?
Correct. In South Africa. Yeah. Um, I was very excited. I was very keen. I really was looking forward to university because as a child, I read at least one book a day. Some years I even managed to get two books a day. So I was a very incessant reader. Even though I was very active as well, I did a lot of things. I didn't, wasn't like a super nerd who only read, but because I read in my dead times, I was able to really maximize my time very efficiently and effectively. Like whenever I stood in line, for instance, I would read. You wait for the teacher in class because they always sometimes, a couple of minutes late or whatever, they leave early or something. Those times, I would be reading. I always had a book on me, always. I never wasted a single second. I truly took to heart an awareness that I had of time being precious. So anyway, so as I went through school, my reading started to evolve, and I started to read like really serious stuff. So by the time I got to university, I was quite thoroughly educated actually already. But anyway, I didn't know it really. I'm just doing my own thing. I'm in my own bubble really. Um, and I was very eager because at university, yeah, you are in an environment with people who want to learn. At school, you're in an environment with people who are there because they have to be there. They don't necessarily want to learn, right? Some of them, yeah, but not all. But university, you're learning what you want to learn, not what's prescribed by, the education department. So this was very exciting, but the reality was unfortunately not what I was hoping for. The lectures and the curriculum, it was all about memorization, wasn't really about true learning. And I studied business science with a major in psychology. So I had two majors, business science and psychology. But I had to learn calculus for the psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, because in the way they had psychology set up, it was really industrial psychology, not therapy psychology. So you had to learn the calculus because you had to know how to conduct experiments and test things. And it's like, really, this is not at all what I wanted to do. And then halfway through that year, I actually started a business. And I'm like, dude, you didn't teach me anything that I needed to know to start this business. None of it. Because they weren't teaching you how to be in business. They were teaching you how to be a corporate employee. This is a whole
Mm-hmm.
different thing. So, so I said, nah, never mind. I'll just go and do my own stuff. Because also, most of the time, whatever I was reading, like in psychology, I had to sort of go backwards a little bit. It was interesting. I still enjoyed my year, but I wasn't getting much value out of it. So I'll just do it on my own and do whatever I need to do. So I didn't finish well, I finished that year. I didn't continue. I said, this is a waste of time. And I was very sad about that. I really like the idea of it. Still do. It still has a romantic appeal, but the reality, not so. And I did learn some very valuable things, like, for instance, the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. I saw this in the psychology professors, right? Because we had a couple of different ones. None of them were people that I considered to be somebody who's got their shit together. No, they were no, they were actually the stereotype of somebody who doesn't have their personal stuff together. Like when you look at teachers or professors, right, and you say, well, okay, there's somebody, you sort of respect them because they've got it together, and whether they know their subject or not, as people, there's a difference, right? So some of them, they might not be the best teacher on the subject, but they basically got their stuff together as people. They're somewhat disciplined, they're honest, they're sensible, they're sober, they're not, indulgent and stuff like this. The psychology professors, they were like, oh my God, talk about just indulgent hot messes, as people would say. They were the classic hot mess, right? And I'm like, but they know their topic, they know their subject. How is this possible? How can you be personally psychologically a mess, but yet know your subject? Because they believed having the information was enough. They believed having the information was enough. And this was a massive trap. So the more they learned, and they really did know their stuff when it came to the information, they could tell you what Freud was all about, and Jung was all about, and Adler and Rogers, and God knows all the stuff, right? They knew all the stuff off by heart. But that just means that they were a computer that had a hard drive full of information, and they could display that information. That doesn't mean that the computer's programming itself is good programming, right? Doesn't mean that the operating system of the computer is working well. And that's the thing that they didn't understand. You've got to apply that stuff, dude. You can't just regurgitate it. And this is where the whole understanding and philosophy of application really, it didn't start there, but where it was crystallized as a full awareness and understanding. Because me personally, in my own learning of change, this was the issue. I started off with awareness at age 10, really looking at what is awareness and how can I be more aware. So this was, didn't matter that I understood it. I had to define awareness for myself. I had to, say what is awareness, and really had to think about it. And that's why I came up with the spotlight and the floodlight understanding. But I said, knowing this didn't help me, because I still ended up being unaware, and I was absolutely horrified at my own unawareness. And this saved me, that at that point, I did not avoid the awful truth of my unawareness. I mean, I was just like, wow, hey, I'm like horrified at this. I got to really do something here. So the result of it was I had to apply every single technique and tactic and mechanism and tool that I could, that enabled me to be more aware. And of course, the profound point of that was I saw habit. It was pure habit, habit, habit. This was what caused the problems, 99 times out of 100. So then I, said that awareness and habit are intricately linked, because what are habits but entrenched unawareness loops? Isn't that what a habit is?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's an unawareness loop. You're doing something without awareness. Isn't that the definition of a habit? Yeah. So that changed it all for me in a very big way, and came to application. If you want to really deal with habits, you've got to learn to do things. And I also saw that I didn't realize it was necessarily the word emphasis, but I also understood from my own practice of doing things that you had to be a little bit obsessed. That's how I thought of it. You had to be a bit obsessed with your new point of learning until it became natural. So for the first, couple of days or weeks or however long it took, that you say, okay, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change this thing. and you had to be obsessed with it to override the habituality, right? And have that, well, now I'm using the word emphasis, but then it was just like energy and focus to entrench the thing. And I did that, some new idea came, something new that I did, I would get really obsessed with it, and I would stick with it until it became innate, and it became a new habit, a new deliberate habit. At least that time, it was just a new habit. Yes, there was some deliberation involved, but some of them became somewhat undeliberate as well, but as I went more and more on, I tried to have it be more and more deliberate. So this is why the whole way in which the programs are structured, they come from, a lifetime of testing, experimenting with this. My understanding of how we learn is absolutely really, up there, because this is what I focused on. I wasn't just focused on learning. I wanted to know how I learned so that I could learn more efficiently, more effectively, quicker, more thoroughly. So I was very, very focused on that. It was a very big deal. It was good to understand. So, doing the repeat backs, it's an emphasis, it's a focus, it's an immersion. You add onto that the takeaways, you add onto that the dictionary of power. All of these are mechanisms which facilitate and enable learning. And then, with the posting is extra emphasis, the takeaways of the, so very, very, very powerful. Very, very, very powerful. Really huge, really huge. Big deals, in other words. Very cool stuff, yeah, Robin?
Yeah, it's
Stand
interesting.
out with. Yeah, yeah,
But there's an awareness that goes along with all of this.
absolutely, exactly.
Because I know when I get the aha and oh yes and practice, but then now where I'm at is I see when I'm in those places, but I also can see that there is an awareness piece that goes with this, that how many times I'm doing it, it's wonderful. But until I really become aware of it, that aha, where you go, oh my gosh, like where everything just
Exactly,
clicks, that spark.
exactly,
So it's
exactly.
almost as if turning the key, everything is working, it's going
Right,
well.
right.
But once you have that understanding of that spark, that the key turned and the spark, that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, exactly. And then also at some point where it becomes entrenched, right? It has to result in a change of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
We have ahas, but they don't always result in changes of behavior. And
Yes.
that's the key. It needs to result in that change of behavior. If that doesn't happen, then your aha is useless. And that's what I saw at university. There was lots of ahaing going on all over the show. And they, the professors were sharing what was ahas to them, but they weren't applying it. There was no application. So it was all meaningless in the end. Meant nothing. Yeah.
Wow. Very
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. It's very powerful. Very powerful. Yeah. Once we start on the path of learning and we are honest, I can tell you so many lessons that I've learned in situations where, well, okay, I'm learning something else, not what they're trying to share. For instance, this square circle thing, right? The square circle understanding, square circle logic, square circle mindset. I think I've probably shared this with you before, right? But since we're talking about university, so the lecturer brings up this thing today. He says, okay, today we're talking about hypnosis and particularly post-hypnotic, right? Hypnosis and the suggestions for a post-hypnotic suggestion. And so he shares this story. He says, so these researchers wanted to study post-hypnotic suggestion. They hypnotized people and they showed them a blank piece of paper. And they said, what you're seeing is a square circle. Remember it, memorize it. Because when one of the researchers named Bill, when he touches his nose in a particular way, like this, then you're going to remember this square circle that you're seeing now, and you're going to draw it for us. All right. So, okay, off they went. They took them out of hypnosis and said, you're not going to remember any of this. And they went and then they had like this cocktail party and they're all mixing around, right? And everything's fine and normal. They're just regular, normal people. And then, of course, Bill touches his nose. And at that point, or maybe said something, I forget what the signal was. It was, something unusual, obviously. All right. So then when that happened, all these people, they suddenly remembered what they had seen. And they'd conveniently left drawing paper and pencils lying around, right? And all the people went to this and they started to do this. But they were, in the story, the people were very energized to do this, to draw this, right? Because of the way the suggestion had made it. And they said, and so the lecturer said, well, and so when they made this, the people all suddenly remembered and they started drawing. And that was the end of the story, because he was demonstrating that post-hypnotic suggestions can work. And this experiment proved that they did work, right? And that was all the point of the story to the lecturer, right? But then he said, as like an afterthought, he said, oh, it was quite interesting also that the people got very stressed trying to draw these square circles, because of course they couldn't draw them, and they kept saying, but I saw it, I know it exists, I can. And they got really bent out of shape trying to draw these circles. And he said, well, this was an unintended consequence of this, and so they had to put the people back into hypnosis and remove this idea, because they were really getting very, very, very upset and bothered by trying to draw their square circles, right? Because I know it exists, I know. So I thought, wow. And then this was just like an anecdotal thing that he just threw out as like a point of interest. But this to me was like, man, wow, this was profound. And the lecturer had completely missed the point of that story. To me, there was a moreness there. The fact that those people could get stressed and bothered and actually try to implement something that was logically inconsistent, was realistically could not exist, but they believed that it did. And that was the key. That belief, that they actually believed something which logically, sensibly didn't exist, could exist, and they tried to implement it. Those factors all combined, this was revelatory to me. I never forgot that. And this is where I said square circles, right? Because that is so literally, and such a perfect name for it too. Square circle psychology. How many people in your life don't you know who believe in something that is totally unrealistic? It cannot happen, but yet they make every effort to implement it. And they get all stressed and bothered when they cannot actually implement what they believe is so. Yeah.
Hmm.
Isn't that incredible? As a profound revelation that people can get disconnected from their logical, rational, sensible size. If they would just think about it, well, a square circle, it can't exist. It's by definition, it's not possible. But they believed it to be. So people could believe that falsehoods can be real because they got stuck in a feeling belief loop. See, and it all came from there. So I'm just saying that, when we start to be focused on learning, we can get learning that was never intended. I mean, this is such a profound psychological understanding. But yes, it happened in psychology class, but it was totally not part of the lesson. They never clicked onto this psychology of square circles. It's a profound, profound, profound psychology.
Do
You
you
see it
think?
in criminals, you see it in narcissists, you see it in any kind of a distorted psychology. You see this where people are stuck in a belief that cannot be true, but they believe it to be true. And they believe it to be true because they have the feelings to back it up, right? So the feelings reinforce the belief reinforces the feeling. Both of those are disconnected from rationality and logic, and they just loop, and the people are stuck. Yeah, very profound. Very, very, very profound. Very, really big deal to understand where people get stuck. Yeah. To realize that the feelings stimulate the beliefs, right? Because in that experiment also, when they were shown the square circle, it was kind of made a big deal. So it was like, oh, a square circle. Oh, yeah. And so they had the feeling to go with it. And then when they were triggered and they remembered it, they felt that they had seen this. So the belief was reinforced by their feelings of having seen it. See? and it all just feeds on its other and it loops around. But the fact was that they were getting stressed doing this, but they continued. They didn't at some point say, to hell with this, I mean, this can't work. No matter how much I may believe it, I can't do it. No, they kept going where they got really discombobulated. I mean, they were starting to freak out, and so it was a real problem. It was really fascinating. Very, very interesting story. Experiment, and the way what was interesting to me was how the lecturer missed it all completely and utterly, and the students too.
That's huge.
Yeah, it was very huge, very huge. So I'm making the larger point that once we get into honesty and self-honesty and impeccability, and we open ourselves to learning, particularly to say that we cannot assume that what we are taught is the lesson. That was another lesson from that, right?
Right.
I got a profound lesson, but it wasn't the intended lesson. When we understand this, everything opens up, right? So bonus lessons, capital G gifts, in other words. That is a capital G gift, no?
Yes.
Yeah. So when we understand capital G gifts, it's transformational, because all the students, they were cued by the lecturer to hear what the lesson was. The lesson was about, post-hypnotic suggestion does exist. Now, today, this is, in those days, this was a new thing, and there was a lot of debate. Does it work? Doesn't it work? And there weren't any, this was like the only research study that had been done on that at that time. So it was quite revolutionary. It's kind of hard to put yourself in that space anymore, because we've taken these things for granted for so long. But at that time, there was a lot of debate. Is this possible to do post-hypnotic suggestion or not? Was a big issue. So these researchers put this to rest, right? And that was what he was sharing. So yes, this has been proven now to exist, right? And okay, you can accept it as a fact. That was what the point of that story was, or sharing the experiment. That's it. That was all there was from his point of view. The debate is now put to rest. It does exist. And okay, move on. The next thing. But if that's all you take, if you learn to just hear what people are trying to say only, you don't listen for the more, you miss out on the more. Doesn't mean what they're saying is incorrect. Of course it is, but there's more. There's always more. So in that one thing too, there's so many things that happen, and I'd always known this, that there's more. It's never in isolation. There's always more. So it's very profound. It's very profound. Yeah. So, for me, being at university wasn't about learning, but it was about becoming aware that I had learned much more than I had any realization, because I was always in my own bubble. I'm just learning. I'm doing my own thing, and I have nothing, no externality, right? Nobody I could speak to about this or discuss it. I mean, most of my friends didn't read books. Not most, all of them. So I was in a very isolated bubble in a way. Not that I was a loner. I was never that. I was always like a popular kid, and I connected and I had friends. So because I understood that I had that side of myself, and this saved me. This came from a very early incident where I understood that I needed to have a social side and a personal side. Now, the personal side is not a hidden side. If somebody wanted to know, if they'd asked me, I would have told them, but nobody ever asked. Never. Not once, ever. Not one of my friends ever asked, or a teacher or anybody, oh, what are you reading? Never. Isn't that amazing? When I was in 7th grade, I was reading, let's see, it was like James Hadley Chase and Mickey Spillane, and those type of detective novels, right? And like James Hadley Chase had a reputation for being a bit racy in the late love scenes, right? And it was sort of regarded as a bit cheesy, but trashy, right? Anyway, so my teacher sees me reading every day. He was a good guy. He was a very good teacher. He was really he was a standout kind of a teacher. He was a very different guy too. Anyway, so he comes up to me one day in the class, and he says, and I could see his quandary. Because now it's like a free time in the class where we could, just sit and do whatever, which it was okay for me to be reading in the class, right? And he says, well, I just want you to know that well, maybe what you're reading isn't maybe the most appropriate. Now, I can't quite get the full range of the quandary. I could clearly see in him, right? Because I already had developed my skills of reading people to some degree, that he was conflicted. He was trying to make an effort to not discourage me from reading, but to not specifically read that type of stuff only, right?
Mhm.
And so this was what he was trying to communicate, but he was really very cautious to not put me off reading, because that was a good thing, but not to read just the trashy stuff. So I got the message. I didn't say anything. I just said yes, sir, because that's how it was in that school. You didn't, you didn't say anything beyond yes, sir. So I didn't change my reading habits or anything, but I did understand it. I knew that it was trashy stuff, and I enjoyed it. But this is the thing, though, that I also understood, that I used to read comics. I didn't start off just reading. I was a little bit anti-reading at one point, like when I very started. And I loved reading comics, but the comics soon became boring, and then I wanted more, and then I started reading. And so the same thing with this stuff. It gets old quickly, and then I kept upgrading. And eventually I did that whole reading project where I read all the classics, through the ages of every kind, literature, philosophy, religion, economics, you name it. I read them in chronological order. It was a huge project. It was a long story. So but it didn't make it. By the time I read it, it just made me realize that, oh, I actually know a lot more than I think I know. My humility was so profound, and it was always such a big deal to me. I never ever grasped what I had learned, which was a good thing, because it saved me from becoming an egomaniac, and having that arrogance of the professors and all that. Because it was all about application, and truly learning. So it kept me going, and there was always more. But then, after that project, it took a long time still. I still realized how much I had learned. So that's really interesting. So I had lots of experiences after that, which which were gifts of application, where I got to test and implement what I had learned, and get to prove that these work in real world circumstances, right? Like when we went to the desert. I mean, that was a very extreme situation. Being homeless is another particular example. Starting off with nothing. I've started off with nothing many times. Um, you know, Very interesting.
When did you come to the US?
In 92, so 30 years ago.
Oh, wow.
31 years ago next month, actually. Yeah, yeah. In February of 92. So, yeah.
Okay.
So I've been now, I think I've been in the US just slightly more than half my life now, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And have you always been in Arizona or have you been all over?
Oh, I've been all over the show. Yeah. I mean, very much all over the show. Yeah. I mean, we traveled a lot at one stage. We used to do camera shows, like they do the gun shows, but with used cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And every weekend it was two different cities. Um, they're big shows, but you can't have them too regularly. Like when you see in your city, you may have that camera show like twice, or the gun show twice a year or once a year. If they're really big. I think the gun shows maybe more often, but with the cameras, it was, that was it. It wasn't very regularly. So a couple times a year in the major cities, but always a pair, like you would do Boston and New York together, or Cleveland and Cincinnati, stuff like this, Chicago, Milwaukee. But this was a lot of driving, because you can't fly. So I mean, we had a minivan, and that minivan, well, eventually it was packed up to the ceiling, almost to the ceiling. I could just see over the top out, full of equipment. I mean, the suspension got permanently bent. It was so heavy. So it's a lot of equipment that you got to drag around. So it means you got to drive. So we were initially based in Chicago, and then in Michigan for a while, and then also later New Jersey. But still, no matter where you are based, you've got to drive. I mean, like we came down to Dallas. Um, we did Dallas, Fort Worth. We went to Florida, Miami, and what was the other? I think Miami and Orlando, maybe. I can't remember what the twin city was. but still, you're going Washington, New York, Boston, all the way across, went up to Minnesota, so all of the Midwest, essentially, everything. I don't know if we ever did Denver, but we definitely did Dallas. So this was, on average, it was about an 8-hour drive to the cities on average, right? Sometimes when the cities are close to you, it's less, but even if it's out of state, then it's still a 3-4 hour drive typically. So it's just a ton of driving, and then it was a lot of work. It was just a huge amount of work. But anyway, it's a very interesting story about how all that came about. So interesting stuff. Yeah, we started with nothing. We had absolutely nothing when we came. So we got picked up hitchhiking, and the guy invited us to come and stay, and he was doing this, and we just, I was helping him unpack his van, stuff like that. Anyway, long story, but we started from there. And then we actually got into the business, and well, so,
You've been all
different
over,
time.
done everything. That's fabulous.
Yeah. So I have a very exciting, from a regular life story. Like, I got tons of fun stories, because that in itself is a really fun story. But like I say, it's kind of a long story if I want to do it full justice. But it's about application, Robin. It's about applications. That the application of impeccability.
Absolutely. So when did you start that? When you really, I mean, I know you've been doing it all your life, but when did you start to sit down and say, okay, there's something going on here. I need to start writing this.
This was when I started putting it down as like programs. This was not, let's
Not
see,
so much the program, but like you just started saying, hey, there's something to this.
right. Well, I knew there was something to it. When I was at school already, even in junior school, I started to, but I never wrote it down as such. That I don't know. Because to me, all right. So let me back up on your question. This is a very, very difficult question to answer. So as I started reading, and when I started my reading project, right, that big major reading project, which first of all was making the list. This is pre-internet days, so making a list of all the classic books in the world. This was a big task. It took me probably, I don't know, a year and a half to just make the list, right? Because you got to do it manually. I asked different people recommendations and stuff like this. I remember the Encyclopedia Britannica had a series that they put out, great books of the world. Now, I didn't have access to the series, but I got a promotional flyer from them that had all those books on. Same thing with Penguin Classics. They also put out this series, but the books weren't available, but I got their promotional material. So anyway, so I made the list, and then I had to acquire, because I wanted to buy the list, and that took me another couple of years to actually buy all the items, because I wanted to read them in chronological order. But when I did, I had the intent to learn from it, and I said, I'm going to underline things, and I had my trusty red pen. I like the red for underlining, and then I copied them out into a big notebook. Right, that was my plan, because I said, and then once I had in the notebook, because then I wanted to take that and really learn it to the point where I don't need the notebook anymore, right? Integrate it into application, right? But as I started reading these, the underlining was a lot less than I thought it would be, yeah, because, well, whenever I'd read before. And I'd read a lot of today. I think they would call it um, what is the name for it? Well, literature, but like there's a special name for it when it's in fiction. Anyway, I forget now. But anyway, like fairly serious stuff, like Herman Hesse and Ayn Rand and that type of writing. Right? I loved it. I read that all through high school, towards the end of my high school, that type of stuff. But here's the thing that I always did, Robin, is why you're asking me a question, and it's kind of as a difficult answer, because whenever I got to something that I read and I didn't understand what it was, I stopped, and I never continued reading until I'd resolved whatever this was. where I'd understood it, I'd figured it out, I'd made it my own. This was absolutely essential for me. How this came about, I have no idea. I mean, I guess it was just me being so bent on learning for real, not thinking I learned. I needed to apply it. I couldn't believe that I knew it because I understood this was my awareness. And I was horrified because in the environment that I grew up, lack of awareness could get you into serious trouble. And once you're aware that lack of awareness can get you into serious trouble, this is a big pressure on you, right? Because I saw all the other kids, they got into trouble regularly, but they forgot, they were unaware from day to day that tomorrow they could get into trouble. And they just repeated. They were like goldfish that lost their memory. It was astonishing to me. I was really, I mean, they got hidings every bloody day. It's like, how do you not learn from yesterday? So, but once you're aware that you could get a hiding, well, then you make an effort to stay out of trouble. Now, there were some kids that were aware of this and caused them inordinate stress. So, they were always afraid day in, day out of getting into trouble. So you had to learn to deal with that. But anyway, so for me, whenever I learned something, I had to be very careful, or at least for me, it was very important to make sure that I absolutely learned the thing. And I did this for vocabulary too. I carried a dictionary on all times, actually a dictionary and a thesaurus, so that I could look up both, because the dictionaries are very limited and the thesauruses are usually more helpful in understanding what a word means. But even with those two, because writers don't always use words in the way the dictionary says, they use them creatively. So I really made that effort to figure out in context what they're saying. Very seldom can you not figure something out in context if you take the time to kind of stop and pause and think about it. So this became a deep habit. So for me, there was no need to write things down or make notes, because I learned it until I knew it and it was a part of me. I couldn't carry on until that happened. And sometimes I would stop and, the thing would loop in my head and I would think about it and explore it and figure it out. And I would think it through to the end. It's where that started. Right. And this is where I learned this thing of to the end, because there were some things where I thought about it. And like, all right, okay. And then I sort of more or less I got it right. I've thought it through now and I let it go. But then it came up again. And then I realized, wow, I hadn't, or I sort of said, I'll finish it later. But then that never really happened to think it through later, because then I realized when I came back to it later, the next day or the next week, I had to start all over again. And I said, no, this is going to be a major waste of time. So, and I realized I was wasting my time, because I realized that if I don't finish the thinking, I have to redo it again. It's like if you're doing an experiment. Like if you've ever done any kind of a science experiment, there's no 90% to repeating an experiment. You've got to do it 100%. Otherwise, it's a total waste of time, right? It doesn't work. So it was the same logic. So then I really understood that you have to think it through to the end. When I was 11, and I know this because of, I was in particular different locations, long story, but anyway, I know the age very specifically. When I was 11, I thought about death, and really thinking death through to the end. And the consequence of thinking about death was for me that I came to be acutely aware of time is precious. Every single moment is precious. That was the takeaway for me from thinking about death. Time is precious. And ever since that age, time was always exceedingly precious. And I literally never made an effort to waste a single second. That's why I read in my dead time. And that's why the thinking things through to the end came about. Because when I discovered myself rethinking things and doing it again, and like, well, yeah, but you thought about this before. How come you're doing it again? And I resented the waste of time. I said, no, all right, so I've got to finish it. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do it again. And that's where it came from, right? From not wasting time. So anyway, so to get to your question, though, about when it started to crystallize, at the end of my big reading project, I started to get despondent, because my intent was to learn, to really profoundly learn. And this big reading project was going on. It started when I was in high school. So I was doing this through my year of university, which was immediately after high school. And then I went to the army, and that was in mid-year of the year after university. So I already started in the last years of my schooling, where that's where I started making the list. And then, while I was at university, I was making the list and acquiring them. And then by the time I got to the army, I already had started to read in the list, right? So, that's basically like a 3-4 year period, because as I ended the army, I came to the end of that list. I think I got to the end of it. But here's the point I want to make about reading this, and to answer your question of how this all started to crystallize. So it was a gift of intent, right? It's a very profound gift of intent. In that, as I was reading and I underlined stuff, it got to be less and less. And actually, when I had this notebook where I'd copy things in. There was very little in it. Very few books actually had something of real value. Doesn't mean they were interesting, but for me personally, I didn't underline a lot in it, and I was a bit surprised at this. Some books I underlined a lot because, well, it was just mind blowing. Completely like, hello, this is like crazy stuff in here. In the Bible, for instance, oh my God, I underlined a ton of stuff, but not because it was valuable, but because it was really, this is in the Bible, really? Boy, I mean, the people that I knew, and it was a very religious community that I was in. If I'd read this stuff out in Sunday school or whatever, people would freak out. They wouldn't believe me that it came from the Bible. Anyway. But so I found very little of value, and I was getting real despondent. And then as you go through the centuries, right, there are a few that stand out. Like Plato was pretty cool. Nietzsche stood out as very cool. But Nietzsche stands out because of his use of language. I mean, the best English prose I've ever read is a translation of Nietzsche. I mean, the skill of his. But again, the end result, the usefulness wasn't all that much. So anyway, but after, in that era, that the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, you get people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Balzac and God knows all of those people, right? There's a ton of them, but they're all very, very negative. I don't know if you've ever read any Dostoevsky, for instance. Oh my God, it's the most depressingly horrible and negative stuff ever, right? I mean, he's writing about BMNs and all the horrors of the world. And of course, what made him a classic was that he spelt the stuff out in detail. He didn't shy away from it. And same thing with Tolstoy. Tolstoy, he's just very long-winded. I mean, big, massive books, right? Because he goes into excruciating detail, which was revolutionary for some people to see, oh, this is what's really going on with people in the detail, right? But if you kind of halfway aware in the world, that stuff's not a revelation for you. It's just boring, right? So it depends who's reading it. But anyway, so I got really depressed because here's my big project, which I've now spent, at that point, a major half of my aware life essentially has been put into this project, right? This is a very major part of a big deal. And I'm getting nothing out of it. So as I started to get towards the end of my list, I started to say, what is it that I'm looking for? What do I want? Now, the other thing that was really interesting in the list, beside, like I said, I mentioned a few that stood out. The Buddhists stood out. Buddhist literature, there was a ton of really good stuff there that was valuable. But the problem with Buddhist stuff was that first, the language was out of time. That's the way I thought of it. It was a language from way back when. It didn't resonate. It didn't gel. Right? It didn't connect. It didn't work for my brain. I liked it. It was cool, but it never quite fitted right into me. So that was the first problem. Secondly, they had a ton of stuff, but Buddhist literature, the Buddhist canon, is so huge. It's like multiple libraries of Congress. It's a massive collection of stuff. Furthermore, we think of Buddhism as a singular thing, and it's not. Yes, they are Buddhist, but there's the Hinayana and Theravada and Tibetism, and all whole different kinds of Buddhisms, and they're vastly different to each other, right? So they had a lot of value, but it was very diffuse and spread out. It wasn't tight, it wasn't contained. Even though it was all connected, you couldn't use it because it wasn't cohesive, right? So I started to develop these intents of what I'm looking for. I wanted something I wanted a complete system to live by. This was very important because I was looking for things to live by. Yeah, that's what I was after. Practical things to live by. Yeah? So I wanted a system to live by that was complete, that had all of everything in it. The Buddhists offer this, but it was too vast, was too diverse, was too fragmented. Secondly, I was interested in stuff that well, now I use the word moreness, but then I think the word I was using was exotic, for want of a better word, because it's all internal. I never expressed this to anybody, so a lot of it was more an idea, and there wasn't necessarily a specific word associated with it. At any rate, so exotic, cohesive, comprehensive, and with real good language. The language had to be appropriate. So I had started to develop this intent. And as I kept reading, I said, man, I'm getting a bit depressed here, but I'm going to finish my project simply because I like to be thorough. I want to do this. And the last, or if it wasn't the last, the actual very last one, it was the second or the third last entry on my list, came about in an unusual way. When I made my list, there was this one boy in school I was friends with in high school. And in my last 2 years of school, there were people who read. Now, I never, for one reason or another, I never actually ever really discussed books with him, which was very interesting to me. But nonetheless, I knew that he was a reader also. And I was sort of loosely friends with him a little bit. I was more friends with him after school than in school. At school, we weren't really friends, but I knew him. And he was an older guy than the rest of it, but he wasn't like, sometimes you got the older kids who've been held back. He wasn't like that. I don't know how come he was older, but anyway, he was kind of an interesting guy. And he was in his own bubble, independence of being he had some. And I knew he read. So I just, on a whim, asked him if he would recommend anything for my reading list. Because otherwise, I had to ask my English teachers that I respected, not all of them, but the ones that I respected. There were a couple of good ones. So he said, he had a recommendation, absolutely, definitely, without a doubt, Carlos Castaneda. He said, but make sure you read them in chronological order. He emphasized this, and it really stuck with me because it was such an unusual recommendation. I never expected him to really recommend anything like that. Or just to make a recommendation. I asked anyway, but the fact that he emphasized you got to read it in order, this stuck with me. So anyway, so I added it to my list. I had no idea what it was about, no clue, because he didn't give me any clue. He just said, "Okay, this you got to, very important." He made a big deal. I could see it was a huge deal to him. So when I finally got to Castaneda, this fulfilled my intent. It was cohesive. The language was awesome, and also it was very exotic. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Carlos's work or not. Yeah, are you?
No.
No. Okay. Now, Carlos's work it was a profound gift, but in the gift, there's a greater gift. Carlos's became very popular in the late 60s and the early 70s. He was on Time magazine cover, I think, in 73. And he revolutionized the whole world because he brought shamanism, this whole concept of shamanism, into the world. And he wrote about his apprenticeship to what in the book is called a sorcerer. Now, he says he's very clear that sorcerer is, for want of a better word. And later books, he uses the word brujo and nawal, and it's all about Toltec stuff. But initially, the first book, he was apprenticed to the sorcerer. Don Juan is the sorcerer's name, or whatever you want to call him, right? Man of knowledge is the term that Don Juan used too, or seer later on. So anyway, but in the first book, he gave him peyote, and he gave him mushrooms, peyote, and the Jimson weed. And so he went on these drug trips that were really profound. Now, of course, late 60s, this is totally the drug era, right? I mean, so these books were very popular because of that. And in that first book, though, my red pen found, I think, at most maybe 10 instances of things to underline. But the things that were underlined were very profound. The rest of the book I threw out. It was like all this drug stuff. It has of no interest to me because, first of all, I can't replicate it. There were very, very specific experiences under specific conditions. And, you know, not only didn't I have access to the drugs, but it was very clear that you needed that guidance of somebody like Don Juan in order to get the benefit of this. And later on, he says to Carlos, the only reason that you were given these, he calls them power plants, is because you were an idiot. You were stuck, and we had to get you unstuck. And he says, this is not recommended. You know, these things come at a great cost. But for me, the drug part wasn't interesting, but his teachings. And the first book is actually called The Teachings of Don Juan, but there's actually very precious little teachings, kind of an oxymoronic title. But the few things that he did say really grabbed me. And one of the things that Don Juan, one of his words, his language was very cool. I mean, he used two things. He said a warrior, and he started to get Carlos to think of himself as a warrior. And there was the warrior's way. He called it the warrior's way. And he was trying to get Carlos to live like a warrior because of responsibility, right? And to say, well, you know, if you're a warrior, you need to live with death. And he said this very clearly. He said, death is a marvelous advisor. And when you understand that, you know, as a warrior, there's no inconsequential decisions. Every decision is critically important because every decision can result in your death. So you need to be profoundly responsible. And this resonated with me because I had experienced this, right? Because the environment I grew up, bullying was a very big factor. And my brother's 4 years older than me, and him and his friends always wanted to bully me, right? So this was and I always managed to get out of it because of awareness. I kind of saw it coming and got out of the way. So I knew that little decisions had severe consequences, right? I understood this when he said responsible. All right, I'm not dealing with death necessarily, but, you know, getting beaten up and death is not all that far apart. Yeah. So I understood about responsibility and preemptive awareness and decision making and living according to that. So it resonated with me. It really touched me. So this whole concept of the warrior's way was something I'd been living already. Then he said something else. And, you know, one of his terms that he used was he kept trying to say to Carlos, listen, Carlos, you've got to be impeccable, right? And he brought this word impeccable and impeccability. Up until that point, that word wasn't a part of my vocabulary, right? I had used the word rightness. For me, it was rightness. So, you know, okay, this is a better word to explain what I'm using than rightness, because rightness, I was capital R rightness now, I would say. But rightness has that implication of morality, where my rightness was really impeccability. So, you know, I said, yeah, that's a better word than rightness. So I switched to impeccability. But this is what I'd been living with. I mean, I got a very profound story about getting hidings, plural, for not eating food that I didn't want to eat, vegetables, essentially, when I was a kid. I'll tell it to you in a moment, right? That was about this rightness, and it had a very profound consequence. Anyway, so from when I got to Carlos, though, now books 2 and 3 are the most profound of the series to me because they are very practical and detail oriented. So when I got to Carlos, my red pen went crazy. Not so much in book 1, but in books 2 and 3, there was tons of practical stuff that I had been living at the time. I'm like, wow, this is cool. Here's what I've been waiting for, looking for my great reading project. I didn't realize until a lot later that what I was underlining was stuff I'd been living. It was enabling me to be consciously aware of what I had been doing, like the rightness and impeccability. You know, I never, because I was too humble to think of that. I was so completely absorbed. I was overly humble that I disregarded my own sensibility. So it took a while for Carlos, but what I did with Carlos is I put all the stuff in notebooks, in big hardcover kind of notebooks, very cool books. And then when I started, got the restaurant, but long story again, This is now in the mid 80s with computers. I was very early adopter for the computer. And I mean, I remember when I first got the computer, there weren't spreadsheets, right? But the spreadsheets, Lotus 123, it was called. I don't know if you remember Lotus 123.
I remember, yeah.
Right. When Lotus 123 came out, it was a revelation. Before that, the word processors came out. And I think the first word processor that was commercial was called Word Perfect. And Word Perfect, and then later Word, and they had this big competition, which Word Perfect lost and Word won. And then same thing with Lotus, later Excel came out and Lotus just fell away. But anyway, Lotus 123, it was super revelationary. I mean, it changed so much. It was like this massive big deal because the spreadsheet, people use it for accounting and all this. And that's how I came to do it, because I needed it for the restaurant, and I had an accountant, but to save money, if I could put the stuff in a spreadsheet. So I actually learned to program a spreadsheet where I could just enter the data and it would put it all together, and it would make a profit and loss statement and all the stuff. And the accountant loved this and saved a lot of time and energy. But anyway, I got to learn spreadsheets. So what I did with all my notes with Carlos, I copied them into a spreadsheet and I started to organize them. I put them in columns, and then I started tagging. Now, today we think of tagging as second nature, right? Hashtags, tagging, we all understand tagging. But that was a completely new concept then. So what I did was I took all of the underlinings. For instance, when Don Juan said, he would say a warrior this, a warrior that, like it would, for instance, he'd say a warrior is always in charge. That was it. You would throw this out at Carlos in between stuff that they were doing. I, of course, copied this out and tagged it as Warrior's Way, right? I called it I think Don Juan also may have used this, but I put it under. So throughout all the books, I had this, and then I could sort the columns, right? Because you've got, column A is the tags and column B is the thing in itself. And I could sort it whether it fell under the Warrior's Way or dreaming or seeing or uh, acting without rewards, assuming responsibility, and all these different categories that things fell into. And this was really cool. And so I rearranged these in different ways. I had one file, and I printed this out. There was a lot of stuff to print out. I printed it out as chronological order of all the excerpts from the book of the stuff that to me had practical, useful value, right? That I wasn't interested in the things like all the stuff about the power plants. I couldn't use this because it's dependent on Don Juan, right? So then I put it in the categories, and then I made a condensed version as well, like a shortcut version. So and I spent a lot of time on this. I mean, well, all the time I was in the restaurant, I worked on sorting and organizing this. So it was basically like a 4-year project where every spare moment I have, I'm working on this, So, but what this was really was all the stuff that I'd been doing all my life up until that point. And when I was at school, I did lots of research and tests and studies, and went to check with people, like, for instance, asking people about traumatic events in their lives, right? I'd come to understand that over time, later on, the traumatic event at the time is traumatic, but you're missing, there's a lot more to it. And so I went back, and I was probably, I don't know, 14 or 15 at the time, somewhere around there. I went to, especially widows, or people that had, like, I remember the one woman had a daughter that had died, but this was like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, in that range, a range of time. And I wanted to test my theory that over time, later, some of things that we see as trauma actually have more to them than the traumatic aspect. There's a greater moreness to it. And so I asked the people, now when you look back at the event, I was very careful not to prejudice my approach. How do you feel about this event? Now, I didn't ask, like, for instance, to cue it, because I was acutely aware of cueing. I didn't say, like, do you think now there was some good reason for it? I just said, how do you feel about it now? Right? After all this time. And every single one of those people, all of them said that like this woman that with a daughter that died, she said, that was the best day of my life. This really surprised me that she would say it so directly. Now, my earnestness got people to be honest. I was exceedingly earnest. I mean, I'm still earnest, but as a teenager, when you have that teenage energy, right? That earnestness really, really brought out. They could not respond in any other way than with complete honesty. It was a double bonus to it. First of all, my earnestness, I now realize, pulled it out of them, right? Because I know when people ask me earnest questions now, I respond in ways that I don't necessarily anticipate, right? It brings a lot out of me that I didn't think to say. Not that I'm hiding it, but just, it opens up the floodgates, as it were. But so that earnestness caused them to be truly honest. But also, my question enabled them to say to me what they had been unable to say and were unable to say to everybody else in their lives. Right? There was one time where they could actually share it. So I gave them that opportunity for that release, which was a very, very big deal. I didn't fully realize that at the time, but it was a big deal. So I don't think she was the first one, but I mean, I remember her saying that. This was the best day of my life. Now, others had said the same thing, but okay. The one woman said, well, when my husband died, that was the best time of my life because he was a big shit, I mean, he was a horrible person. So when he died, this was great. But don't you dare tell everybody I said that. They all said that to me. All said, don't you dare tell anybody I said, because I will deny it, right? And this is between you and me. It's not something, and I understood this. And they saw that I understood that they couldn't share this publicly. But because I was earnest and I was looking for the truth and really wanted to know, and I wasn't the usual kid, obviously, because for lots of reasons. But anyway, so I got this profound understanding from this. So my point is that I'd done lots of research and tests and studies. I mean, that's just one that stands out, but I did tons of this. So I had built myself a profound understanding of psychology, a philosophy to go with it, the philosophy of rightness, which of course became way of impeccability. When I got to Don Juan and he's talking about impeccability, it's like, wow, it really resonated with me. It took me a long time to really make that connection. It's resonating because I'd been doing it, but because I'd been doing it internally and not verbalizing it, I never had the vocabulary necessarily. I mean, I had a good vocabulary, I had an excellent vocabulary, but I never used my vocabulary. I tried to with my friends, but I got into trouble. Like, oh, you're trying to be a smart ass, you're trying to be an intellectual, whatever, trying to be an egghead. And that was very uncool. I was a very cool kid. Despite being the biggest nerd you could ever imagine, I was also a very cool kid, maybe the coolest even sometimes, because I had this understanding of the duality. So I had to stop using my vocabulary. So anyway, just because of the nature of the environment. When I got to the last 2 years of school, I could use it a bit more because that was a very different school. But another long story. I got lots of long stories, Robin. This is all very, very long stories. And I'm still trying to answer you. And I'll finish up here. But when I first started to actually formalize it and write it down, I never liked writing. This was, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe, I don't know how many years ago now, but relatively recently. I started to write it all down. I never was interested in writing before that, but the universe forced me into it. Just interesting. Yeah. So I've had a whole lifetime of testing. Let's put it that way, right?
I love
testing.
that. Thank you for sharing. I love that.
Oh, pleasure. There's lots more stories. Don't get me started on stories. I mean, this is a tiny fraction of it. I was going fairly quickly because you asked me a specific question, and I can't answer that question without the stories to support it. But then, when I started writing it out, I realized how much that had been, and this was, I had created the stuff, and, Carlos was simply a confirmation for myself to break me out of my inappropriate humility. And that's still difficult for me to do, to acknowledge stuff. But what was very important to me, Robin, in my learning, I always wanted to develop things where we could, as I'm saying we as sentient beings, where we could do this by ourselves. This was key for me. I always was focused on this. that you can learn it without a teacher, without a guideline. That you can, if you have the starting points and you just click that you can, it can be figured out by oneself, right? And this is, it's underlying everything that I share, self-evident sensibilities. Don't take my word for it. Learn to figure it out for yourself. Once you develop that habit of checking it and rechecking it, the takeaway habit, the thinking it through to the end habit, the multiple perspectives habits, those all enable us to figure it out for ourselves. And this is absolutely critical. I feel that any system which isn't based on that is a flawed system. Because what if you grow up like I did, in a bubble environment? Yeah. You need that one idea that you can. And so any cohesive, sensible system has to be one that can be self-created. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
you may lose out by default by simply not knowing of the possibility of doing it by yourself. Yeah. And that's where the rules of sentience comes in. Because now you are, by putting this out as the starting point, as if this became a global thing, even though you might not have in your individual household, rules of sentience, there's a lot of nonsense, you got to go to church and all this, but it's still there, right? It's still an alternative. If you're going to church, like I did, I went to church. I was very serious about it at one point. When I started, when I was very young, I was kind of anti-church. But when I got to be 11 specifically, right at that time about death, I said, well, you know what? I've been disregarding the church and religion as a lot of nonsense, really, simply because, well, most of the time they were a bunch of hypocrites, in my opinion, saying all the stuff, right? And the teachers, they weren't sensible teachers. Did you ever have teachers young that you truly respected? Well, I never did. So anyway, I didn't think they were really, really like sensible people. But anyway, same with my parents. They were just ridiculous as far as I was concerned. But anyway, for good reason, not just my opinion. But so I said, well, I'm going to really, okay, I'm going to read the Bible and see if I'm going to give it a good, fair shot, in other words. And I made an effort. I read the Bible every day as prescribed. And, I had to give it up after all. My honesty just simply said, no, sorry, it's not enough here. It's too much contradiction. And so there was some valuable stuff, sure, but too much, it's not cohesive, too contradictory. So, but I did give it a good shot. I was on a point that I wanted to make, though. But so in that, though, I said, no, you've got to think about the stuff for yourself. And if you go by what you taught, you're going to get stuck in a hurry because, when you take like the religion, it's got too many agendas and contradictions. You got to figure it out for yourself. And that's where I came up with the rule of sentience. I think it's number 4, very important one. At that time, right? This time, age 11. The individual and the individual alone is the final arbiter of truth.
Well, I can share with you that the entire time you've been sharing with me, that is exactly what I've been thinking of, the rules of sentience.
Exactly. And
So,
that's where the rule of sentience project really it originated, to say that we lose out by default. And this is something that Don Juan also said a lot, right? He kept saying we lose out by default, because the default is that you have limited options. And most people, unfortunately, believe that their limited options are the only options. So the rule of sentience idea is to have this be a worldwide thing that's in all cultures across the world, to be aware that there are other options than your cultural family options, your bubble that you in, right? Because this is something that's out there. At some point in your life, you're going to bump into it. And just the idea, just this awareness that there is a potential alternative, that breaks the bubble of the only thing is your particular religion, culture, whatever. And that's huge, right? The awareness of option, right? This is the key. That's all we need, is to have this awareness of option. And this is why moreness, it's just that one word, moreness, is such a profound philosophy, because there's more. Oh, how many people do not realize or are aware or believe there is more? once you know it, it's like, duh. But think back into when you were a child. You just believed your parents, your teachers, that was your world. That was all. There was nothing else beyond that, outside of that. Yes?
Mm.
There was no moreness, in other words. None.
All right, well, I hate to cut you short, but I have to get ready. I have to bring my car in for an
I was trying to
alarm.
hurry up. I said, man, you started a big question, but maybe next time we'll continue some more, because this is very useful stuff. It's very profound stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Like I told you, rules of sentience. That was
Yeah,
from the
and I want to go back to rules of sentience, because there was more I want to share with you there. So we never even got into the rules themselves and the vertical
No,
and
we
the
just
horizontal
started. You
learning.
just showed me
Yeah.
different things. So
Yeah, but we'll get into it. So there's a lot more to get into there. It's a fun thing. It's a fun project. So yeah.
all right, you have a great
have the
day, and I
follow-up.
will see you probably on Thursday.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. I'm looking
right.
forward to it. I always do. I enjoy our time together. It's a big deal, Robin. All right. See you.
Have a
you
great
Thursday.
day.
Bye-bye, Robin. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.